New at 4, the sex offender who once ran the NOPD's pedophile investigation unit is out of federal custody.
Chris Joseph reports the sex offender registry lists his address in New Orleans.
Stanley Burkhardt was convicted of multiple sex crimes in the 1980s and 1990s. Federal officials confirmed he was released from custody on August 14th. Now, Fox 8 ran multiple investigations into Burkhardt and uncovering allegations he raped a boy who met with NOPD after allegedly being raped by a school janitor in the 1970s. In 2019, state and federal officers arrested Burkhardt for failing to register as a sex offender in Louisiana and violating the conditions of an earlier release. Richard Winman, the boy mentioned earlier, filed a lawsuit against Burkhardt over the alleged abuse and warns the public about him.
I think that every parent or anybody that has custodial responsibilities, that fiduciary to children, should keep those children far away from that house.
Now, court records show Burkhardt will not have a curfew, home detention, or home incarceration restrictions. The Office for Burkhardt's federal public defender said its lawyers could not comment. Back to you.